Just as an introductory clarification, all the explanations given about me is that's not really true. It just is an embarrassing thing. The second thing is that I am not a doctor, nor am I an academician, nor am I trained in research. I mean, whatever I have work that I have done is which arose out of the compulsions of the various movements and various struggles. The title of this session or my presentation is basically it's about understanding tribal people's issues from the tribal people's perspective, what a tribal people-centric framework. Now, if you remove the word tribal, it would be much more appropriate because this is also, this kind of an approach is also applicable to any section of the people. I would not actually be looking at COVID, but I would be looking at the tribal people and suggesting what could possibly be the approach or the framework with which one could study with reference to the COVID. Now, what to study will depend upon why we want to study COVID at all. What exactly is the purpose? Now, what is COVID? Is COVID the virus, a disease, treatment, transmission control methods, lockdown, vaccination? This is one perspective with which one could look at COVID. You could also look at COVID in another perspective. Is COVID an issue of disease, medical care, healthcare, health service, or of governance? Now, both these two different approaches, both these are important. The second is much more important than the first because the first is embedded and is operational in the second frame. If you look at health, where does health come into the picture? The right to health has not been expressly identified under Article 21 of the Indian Constitution. But nevertheless, if you look at the Supreme Court of India, what it has always maintained and said is that the right to health is actually a constitutional right. And particularly linked to Article 21 of the Constitution of India, which guarantees the fundamental right to life and personal liberty. Now, who is in charge of health? Health is a state subject. The central government enacts laws. The implementation of health is actually vested in the state governments. But the fact remains that the state government have always struggled to uphold their constitutional responsibility of public health management due to budgetary, institutional, and other capacity constraints. COVID-19 particularly has revealed how over-dependent states are on the central government for technical expertise and financial support. And to advise the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare, there is a plethora of institutions, National Center for Disease Control, National Health System Resource Center, and Indian Council of Medical Research. So there is a centralized structures, centralized power, centralized budgetary provision over a subject matter which is to be taken care of by the state. And therein lies one major issue. Now, an area of study can also be looking at, how this kind of a structure has actually, enabled or disabled the interventions in relationship to COVID. Now, what is health? According to the World Health Organization, health is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. In other words, if you are looking at COVID, you need to look at COVID from this perspective that it is not the absence of COVID, which is the issue, but the whole existence of communities, which what they call, which is the determining factor of how a pandemic like COVID would impact on the community. Now, if you look at the term governance, now what is exactly is governance? Probably we may think that governance is actually related to governments, but not necessarily so. All the processes in which governments are involved, or for that matter, all the processes that are involved in the in governing, whether it is undertaken by government, by market, and by various networks, even whether in a family, a tribe, formal or informal organizations or territories, through laws, norms, power, or language of an organized society is actually governance. So governance covers the whole gamut of existence, the manner in which society has organized itself. Then COVID could then be examined from the governance perspective of how governments, markets, or network responded to COVID by acts of commission or omission, and omission that has a bearing on people, on their physical, mental, and social well-being. I'll just give you some random examples of issues that are COVID-related as well as government-related. For instance, lockdown. This is a COVID response by the government, largely the central government. What it did was it left millions of migrant laborers stranded in urban spaces, and they were forced to walk hundreds of kilometers to their homes amidst hunger, police repression, and death. You'll find that the lockdown itself was not applied in every sector. There were certain sectors that were exempted from lockdown. And the excuse was that they were important sectors. A classic example of a sector with relationship to tribal and tribal region is the mining sector. Mining sector was exempted from lockdowns. If you look at the state government, if you look at the governments, they liberally used Section 144. There were ban on gatherings and protests. Court functioning had largely, declined or got stranded. There are reports of increased authoritarianism from the state apparatus, state repressions. These are just random. I think there could be many more one can actually list out. A second thing that one could think in terms of is the land and natural resources. Now, during this COVID, pandemic period or the lockdown period, did anything happen specifically around land and natural resources? Was there a decline in the enforcement of land rights laws? Was there an increase in land grabbing? There are also, for instance, the government had decided that we should open up agricultural lands for industry. Forest diversion increased along with compensatory afforestation, which is negating or violating the rights of forest dwellers. The Ministry of Environment and Climate Change on 6th April 2020 instructed all states and union territories to ensure a reduction in human-wildlife interactions by restricting the movement of people in the protected areas. One of the arguments that was said was that, coronavirus came from bats and from the wild, forests. And in the forest, there are a lot of wild species which have a lot of viruses. And with the tribals moving inside the viruses, inside the forest, they would become viruses. And these tribal viruses, they move out and it will spread to the mainstream. So there was an attempt to clamp down on the tribals, restricting them to their settlement. Maybe it could have, the potential of impact would be about 3 to 4 million people who live in and around the protected areas. Maybe many of you may know about the Forest Rights Act of 2006. It was notified and it became operational in 2008. And right then, you would find that a number of retired forest officers, associations, and some environmental NGOs had filed cases across the country and in the Supreme Court, and the case was going on. I'm not getting into the details of what the case is all about or what the Supreme Court did. But suffice it to say that on 13th February 2019, the Supreme Court had said that those claims which were rejected under the Forest Rights Act, the claimants should be evicted. Immediately there was a lot of protest, and the central government scrambled and asked the court to keep this order and hold, and the Supreme Court held it. And the states then came up and they said, look, we have not implemented the law properly, and therefore many of these rejections are not in order. So therefore, in order to find out which are the correct rejected claims, we need to review the whole claim. So the whole review process started, and it is continuing to be reviewed since 2019. Now, COVID has become a very good excuse. Literally, the review has stopped, and any day the Supreme Court could call for could have the next hearing. Along with that, if you look at the data in relationship to the Forest Rights Act implementation during the COVID period, you will find that it is almost become standstill. Another area of importance would be, like, for instance, if you scan the media since March 2020, you'll find a number of things that there are been a lot of evictions and displacements. For instance, on 24th April, the Konda Adivasis in Korahandi district of Odisha were evicted violently. In Gujarat, for instance, the forest officials set fire to the houses of Adivasis in Dang district. There were evictions in Rewa in Madhya Pradesh, Telangana. You'll find also, very interestingly, a number of cases came out against evictions and displacement. Allahabad High Court, Madhya Pradesh High Court, Mumbai High Court, Telangana. These courts had to intervene and issue orders asking the state to stop eviction during this COVID period. If you look at another arena of impact of COVID, the changes in law. Like for instance, the labor laws were changed in Uttar Pradesh, Madhya Pradesh, Gujarat, Maharashtra, Goa, Odisha. You look at the Ministry of Environment and Forest, they actually issued a draft environmental impact assessment in March of 2020, which actually proposes diminishing public hearings, weakening the consultation process, pardons projects which has violated the environmental laws. It exempts certain categories of industries from the environmental impact assessment. It also says, for instance, that projects that are located within 100 kilometers of the international border need not have public hearings. So there is a deregulation of the environmental regulation. You also see the Ministry of Environment speeding up the meetings of the expert appraisal committee, suggesting that that this committee should meet at least twice every month, so that it should cut down time for environmental clearance. So fast-paced, fast-track clearance of projects without the due diligence in processing. You'll find also amendments being brought to varieties of laws, and one such law which impacts the tribals is the Mines and Mineral Regulations and Development Act of 1956, where it says that there will be an automatic extension of all approvals, licenses, and valid rights to the successful bidder of an existing mining lease, meaning that you have a mining lease, your term period is over, now somebody else is taking over the mining, and that somebody else will be exempted from the purview of all the regulatory aspects of under the law. If you look at, say, for instance, you have a number of bodies which clears up various projects. For instance, you have the Forest Advisory Committee constituted under the Forest Conservation Act of 1980. And there is an expert appraisal committee for environmental clearance. Now, if you look at their minutes of the meeting during this particular COVID period, you'll find that the rate at which projects were approved, cleared, all through video conferencing, has really picked up the pace, and they actually increased. So, say for instance, between March 24 and June 30th, that's about, say, 2-3 months, 120 projects were recommended, 90 were deferred, 30 projects returned, and 2 projects were rejected. About a quarter of these projects actually fell within what you call as the scheduled area, which is there in 10 different states. That's largely the central. Now, if you look at the media in terms of the kind of, what are the Adivasis in the scheduled people and how they responded, you'll find varieties of anecdotes. Now, for instance, the anecdote in Gadchiroli from a district in Maharashtra, which says that many of the tribals who lost their job and they came back to their villages, they were being provided, and the loss of job actually increased their vulnerability. But it is very interesting that in Gadchiroli, the villages organized and made sure that all these families are fed properly. Now, the question is that, why Gadchiroli district could do it. The significant thing, one of the significant things is that Gadchiroli is the region in India where, the most successful implementation of the Forest Rights Act has taken place. Largely, the forest is now taken over by the Gram Sabhas, and the Gram Sabhas have increased their earning. And each of the hamlets would have maybe about a few crores of rupees as profit every year. In fact, they have a surplus of money. They don't know what to do with the money. And all these are because of the full implementation of Forest Rights Act. In fact, many other state governments are sending their bureaucrats to learn the success in Gadchiroli. So it's no wonder that Gadchiroli people decided to take care of their unfortunate brothers and sisters in their villages. You also find various other instances where people have created their own checkposts to prevent people from outsiders entering their village. Or for that matter, many of the migrant tribal workers who returned, they were asked to climb up on top of the trees so that they can be quarantined, so self-isolation. There are also stories about how in many of the communities, they decided that they will change their pattern of what they cultivate. Instead of looking at what the market wants, they felt that it would be more sustainable if they think in terms of what the community wants, and therefore shift towards subsistence farming rather than from market induced farming. You also see some negativities. For instance, the lockdown was a grand excuse by the traders and the middlemen to slash the prices of minor forest produce and various other agricultural produces. And in other words, there's a large scale expropriation of surplus or producers by the tribes. Now, now I'm shifting towards looking at the tribal situation. I mean, looking at what do we understand? Why should we look at an issue from a people-centric fashion? Just to give you two simple examples to highlight that approach to our research or study, our perspective is going to determine what we discover. Take for instance the subject matter of forest, again because forest is largely important to the tribes. Now, for some strange reason which nobody knows, as early as 1956, the government of India's national health policy declared that 33% of the land area in every state should be forested. Now, don't ask me or anybody why that. How exactly it is done. Okay. Now, if you look at the latest Forest Survey of India report of 2020, you'll find that out of 28 states in the country, there are 13 states which has 33% and more forest cover. And if you look at which are the 13 states, you will find that all the 8 northeastern states are in this list of 13. Some of you may be interested that other than these northeastern states, the other states which has this 33% forest coverage include Goa, Kerala, Uttarakhand, Chhattisgarh and Odisha. Odisha is the latest entry into this list. Now the whole question is that, how is that all these 8 states, northeastern states, have 33% and more forest? Look, about more than half of Northeast is forested. Why? In fact, if you look at what is the rate of looking at the changes that have taken place on forest, you'll find that largely Northeast has maintained their forest except for Nagaland. If you look at dense forest, you'll find that almost all the states have increased their dense forest except for Arunachal Pradesh and Assam. You'll also find another one interesting feature is that more than half of the forests that are available are not under the control of the Forest Department, not under the Indian Forest Act. Most of the forests in the Northeast are called as unclassed forests. Unclassed forests are not available, not there in Sikkim, but it's there in many other states. For instance, you have Nagaland, about almost more than 97% of the forest is unclassed, meaning it's not reserved forest, it is not protected forest, and therefore not under the Forest Department. You'll find the lowest is Arunachal Pradesh, with about 60% is forest. You'll also find that, with reference to the Forest Rights Act implementation, you'll find except for Assam and Tripura, all other states have decided they don't want this Forest Rights Act. Why? Because the forests are anyway under the control of the people. Where the government of India doesn't have a say, where the state government doesn't have a say, the Indian Forest Act is not applicable. In fact, even large part of revenue lands, the revenue laws are not applicable. It is the laws traditionally recognized and practiced by the community which is applied there. In other words, you'll find an interesting feature that where there are no forest department or government control, where it is under the collective governance of the tribals, you'll find forest thriving. It's a very similar feature you'll find in Central India too, where the so-called tribal districts, which is the scheduled area districts, are also having the highest level of forest. Now the whole question is that, when somebody is studying on forest, the question in relationship to tribals, the question one has to ask is that how is that in Northeast situation is like this? What has happened that led to a different trajectory of existence in the Northeast, which is not seen, because the popular narrative about scheduled tribes is scheduled tribes are poor, illiterate, backward, extreme poverty, they are kicked out, displaced. It's a miserable story, which is actually factually not true. There are many things that, in fact, I would argue to the extent that, for a long, long time, we have been, whenever we talk about tribals, we think it's a matter of tribals. The tribals also think that whenever it's a matter, it's an issue of tribal, it's only related to, it concerns only tribals. It's not true. When you're looking at governance or people, it concerns with, it's part of the larger issues of democracy. Now I'll take one more example. That's literacy. If you ask anybody which is the state which has the highest literacy, everybody would know it is Kerala. If you ask which is the second, third, fourth, you'll have to look at the list. Now, if you look at the literacy rates statewide in the country, you will find that all the 8 northeastern states which has the highest share of scheduled tribe population, ranging from 12.45% in Assam to almost about 95% in Nagaland. And you'll find that the literacy rate in the Northeast is higher, very much significantly higher than the national average. 4 of these states are overwhelmingly tribal majority. 5 of the Northeast states are in the top 10 states with highest literacy rates. You will find that the differential between the general population literacy rate and the scheduled tribe literacy rate is hardly there is any variation. In fact, you will find in many of the states that the tribal educational status is superior to non-tribal educational status. The question that we need to ask is that how come this is another part of the tribal reality or Indian reality. Now, if you want to learn and address this, one has to look at the history of the Adivasis. I'll try to be as brief as possible. The first, let me clarify that all Adivasis are not scheduled tribes. All scheduled tribes are not Adivasis. Scheduled tribe is nothing but an administrative term which is not even permanent as per law. If you look at the classical feature of Adivasi, which you don't find in the mainstream or the non-tribal, by and large, is the manner in which they have organized their production, what you call as a collective mode of production, which is non-feudalistic and which is not capitalist. Another feature is that you will find that the Adivasis have not been part of the feudal structure, which means they're not part of a caste structure. They have been outside. During the pre-British period, they were part of the realm of the various kingdoms, but the king's rule did not extend, or laws did not apply largely to the tribal regions. This is across the country you will find. As a result of it, what has happened is that the tribals always kept themselves away from the mainstream. Now, the mainstream, it is conveniently, my mainstream would argue, oh, they are isolated, discriminated, and therefore we should integrate them, assimilate them. But from an Adivasi point of view, the point of view is that thank God we are keeping away from them. We are free. So there is a difference in perspective in terms of what you say. And the result of that is, in the reason why the Adivasis have kept themselves away is that historically they are a people who are a free people. So therefore they understand what freedom is all about, because they have a living memory of what a freedom means. If you look at the mainstream, you are either an enslaver or a slave. I'm referring specifically to the caste structure during the feudal period. And therefore, when the Britishers entered India, they faced consistent resistance from tribal areas, where the non-tribals succumbed, and they easily, because they are used to either being slaves or enslaving others, they understood the Britishers, and therefore they subjugated themselves to the British. Whereas the tribals kept away, they ran away, they fought, they continued fighting generations. Now all these things led to a spate of laws which recognize and, in other words, give a formal legal frame to their freedom. I'll just give you an example. 1837, the Wilkinson rules in Chaibasa, the Kolhan area, presently in Jharkhand, where literally it said, like, you are not part of the British Empire, you are almost like a free country, you can rule yourself according to your own laws. Then you have the Inner Line Permit, which was enacted in 1873, which still continues in Arunachal Pradesh, Arunachal Pradesh, Mizoram, hill areas of Manipur and Nagaland. Then you have the Scheduled District Act of 1874, which said that no act of the British would apply to these areas, which is a scheduled area. And if the governor of the province has to decide which law should be extended in toto, which law should be modified and extended. You will find that there are also a number of other regulations, local regulations. Like, for example, you have the Santal Pargana Tenancy Act of 1876, which protects the lands of the Munda tribe. The Santals. Then you have the Chota Nagpur Tenancy Act of 1908 to protect the lands of Mundas and Urals. Basically, it says that these lands are the community land, and you have the right to control over the land. Government of India Act 1935 again recognizes the earlier Scheduled District and the provisions under the Scheduled District Act, essentially incorporating that under the Government of India Act. And then you have the Indian Constitution, which almost in effect transfers what you call as the partially scheduled, partially excluded areas, which is in the central India, as the 5th scheduled area, and the fully excluded areas of the northeast as the 6th scheduled area. And a result of this constitutional provision led to 10 scheduled area states, 10 states having scheduled areas, that is Jharkhand, Orissa, Himachal, Andhra Pradesh, Telangana, Chhattisgarh, Rajasthan, Madhya Pradesh, Gujarat and Maharashtra. Kerala had also is the only other state outside of this area which had put up a proposal for scheduled area, but it is still not recognized or cleared by the central government. Under the 6th schedule in the northeast, there are 10 autonomous district councils. 3 of them are in Assam, 3 in Meghalaya, 1 in Tripura, and 3 in Mizoram. Now, all these autonomous councils generated more demands, and therefore you have 14 autonomous councils brought through state legislation, not the 6th schedule, meaning that the powers of the state has been transferred. 6th schedule, the autonomous district councils are considered to be a state within a state. Autonomous district council also has legislative powers, judicial powers. But in this autonomous councils created by the state, there is no judicial powers, there is no legislative powers. They have judicial powers but no legislative powers. Now you'll find that 6 of these state-created autonomous councils are in Assam, 6 in Manipur, and 1 in Ladakh, in the erstwhile Jammu Kashmir region. Then you have the special provisions, Article 371A for Nagaland, 331G from Mizoram. Essentially, what it says is that on laws of the parliament on certain subjects, religious and social practices, customary laws, regulation of civil and criminal justice, ownership and transfer of land. Any laws related to these subjects, if it is enacted by the parliament, is not applicable to the state, then their assembly will have to pass resolution to make it. Incidentally, the Forest Rights Act is not made applicable Nagaland has stipulated no. And the reason is that they feel that forests are with the community, so what's the point in having this law? There are also numerous other kind of very interesting laws. For instance, the Nagaland Tribal Area Range and Village Council Act of 1966, which provides a tribal council for each tribe, an area council in Dimapur and Kohima. You have a range council where range is notified, that is in Mohawk and Kohima. 16 tribes in Nagaland, they occupy distinct territory and therefore have a distinct traditional system of self-rule, which is formally recognized. And every village constitutes their own council. And there are many laws which actually transfer the power to the village council. For instance, Nagaland Communitization of Public Service and Institutions Act of 2002 has transferred part of primary health care, that is you have the mini primary health center up to that level, has been transferred to under the control of the village council. Meaning that right from appointments, money, the property, everything is managed by the village. You also have education up to middle school. Everything is handed over to the village. So they are in control. And in fact, studies have shown that after the transfer of power to the village, the quality of health services improved so much that the World Health Organization gave an award to the Nagaland government. UNESCO gave an award to Nagaland government because the educational status of the children increased manifold after the schools were transferred to the village. Then you have in 1996 what you call as the Panchayat Extension to the Scheduled Areas Act. That is 73rd Amendment on Panchayat Raj Act. It exempted, it did not apply to the 5th Scheduled Area. There are also other areas which did not apply, like for example, Mizoram, Nagaland, Darjeeling Hill Council area, 6th Scheduled, etc. So the Constitution required that the Parliament enact a separate law. And this law was enacted in 1996 after a 3-year struggle by the Adivasis. And it is interesting to know that this is the first law in this country which confers authority to the village directly. In other words, the village becomes the statutory authority, they become the government, they become the officials. Now this framework got extended in 2006, again through a 3-year national level struggle under what kind of, which came through with this law called the Scheduled Tribes and Other Traditional Forest Dwellers Recognition of Forest Rights Act of 2000. Now, the approach, so you find a very interesting thing. The whole historical narrative of governance laws in this country has two parallel tracks. The first is the tribal, which is the non-mainstream, which actually started off with autonomy. It wanted to retain autonomy, and subsequently post-independence period, deepened and strengthened the democratic or the democratization. You look at the mainland. Mainland laws, you find that we have reached a situation where right now we feel that we don't even want the right to vote. For instance, you have the the municipal elections are not to be held in industrial township, and industrial township is exempted from municipal laws. That was introduced, or that was integrated in, that was a practice which got integrated into the constitution in the 74th Amendment, you would never find a single article criticizing that, that we are de-democratizing ourselves. We are, the reason is very simple, because we don't have a tradition of having democratic values of a free community like the Adivasis. In other words, what I mean to say is that the trajectory of governance of tribals is actually more important to the non-tribals than to tribals, because it simply is a direction which deepens democracy. Now, given this kind of a context, the question is, you also need to see what is the state approach. The state approach is very simple. Tribal areas are wealthy, so we need to make the tribal areas as an internal colony. We need to extract all the minerals, the water, and resulting in maybe about 20-30 million people be displaced, their right to land not being recorded, etc. Now, what has all this got to do with COVID? What we need to understand is roughly about the maximum of about 60% of scheduled tribes are covered by one or other provisions which I mentioned. That is the fifth schedule, sixth schedule, or special provisions for Nagaland, Mizoram, the Pesa region, the Forest Rights Act, etc. Everything put together, all these special provisions in the law, in the constitution, at best covers about say 60% of the tribal population. The maximum, I would believe it would be less than that. I do have the statistics related to the area. I'm not going into the details, but just to tell you that something like about 13.5% of the land area, the maximum, is the area covered by these special legal provisions of autonomy. In terms of, and you must understand that these autonomous regions are not the regions where only tribals live. You'll find that there are also a large section of them are also non-tribal. So the non-tribals are also enjoying this autonomy because they are living in a tribal region. I'm not going into much detail about it, but rather wait for any discussions. But just to say that, what has this got to do with COVID? What we need to understand is that we have this whole differential governance structures. Now, whether they are functioning properly or not, like for example, there are in 10 states, you have what you call as the scheduled area, and you have the Panchayat extension to scheduled areas act. If you ask me, is that particular law being implemented, I would say no, for a variety of reasons, which I won't go into the reason. It is not implementable right now. It has been subverted by the bureaucracy. Just like the Panchayat Raj Act of the 73rd Amendment. The 73rd Amendment of the Constitution talks about transfer of 29 subjects to the Panchayats. No state law has transferred. Okay. The Panchayat should have been in control of the department of bureaucracy. But actually the reverse took place. The Panchayat became an extension and an appendage of the department. The only law which actually confers the power to the Gram Sabha, that is what you call at the hamlet level Gram Sabha, is in Panchayat extension to scheduled area. And it says that, that the structures above cannot and should not encroach into the powers of the people. And in fact, it says that the structures above should be conducive to ensuring that the Gram Sabha functions autonomously, and therefore, for the Gram Sabhas to function autonomously, and the structures above also should be autonomous. But the provisions of these autonomous structures was the job of the bureaucracy of the state, and the state bureaucracy very neatly did not want. So the Indian governance structure is deeply embedded and it retained the colonial structures where of a subjugated state and a subjugated people. And the process of democratization has slowly seeped in only say, maybe after the 1990s. Generally, the laws have been strengthening the colonial structure rather than the governance structure or of democracy. So the question is that the challenging question is that this whole COVID pandemic, how did these autonomous structures respond? That is the question. That would be very insightful. Because you also have a substantial population lying of scheduled tribes who are outside of these areas of autonomy. So one could, in fact, compare what has been the. I mean, has there been a difference in the structure? I mean, in the response to COVID, in the management of COVID. I already mentioned that where Forest Rights Act has been successfully implemented, you find that the people who returned after the lockdown were not left hungry. They were taken care of. So you can compare with areas like Kerala, where hardly any transfer of power has taken place between the forest department to the tribal villages, or in many other states. One could have a comparative study of what is to what extent the community is enabled to handle their health care, in relation, by virtue of the political and governing space that is available through laws, and in actually, in reality, that kind of a study would be very, very useful. I stop here, hoping to give more time for discussions. Thank you.